Greetings, one and all, and welcome back for another Naval History edition of the Proceedings Podcast, sponsored by the William Wood Foundation. I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine, and I welcome you back here again on this 8th of November, 2022. It was 80 years ago this very day that Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, was launched. This was the first time that the Allies really, in a huge way, are taking the fight to the Axis foe. It was an unprecedentedly epic undertaking for the Allies, but it also could well be described as, quote, risky, rushed, and unready, as Vincent O'Hara, author of the celebrated book on Operation Torch, mentions in our cover story in the current issue of Naval History Magazine, just released. Hopefully you've got your copy and you're already plowing through it. And today we're going to talk about the Operation Torch in honor of its 80th anniversary. And I am glad to welcome back to the podcast, Vince O'Hara. Vince, welcome.
Eric, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here on this day. 80 years ago, the war changed. And I think that it's appropriate to give some of the credit to Operation Torch that it really does deserve as far as its impact and it's just the scope of the operation and what it meant to the Allies in World War II.
In many ways, it feels like a precursor to the Normandy invasion that would follow a couple years later, in terms of like getting the Allies together, learning how to operate together, or learning the hard way.
Learning the only way that you can really learn in wartime, because the trick of it is the other people are trying to mess you up all the time, and sometimes they're very successful at it. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Operation Torch, it was the first of the series of massive amphibious operations that did bring the war directly to the Axis powers. And as such, obviously, there were many issues that the Allies needed to work out. And they did it successfully. So in that respect, Torch did make Normandy possible.
It also, I would imagine on the home front, it felt kind of good. We're kind of finally striking back.
It's kind of funny. I asked my mother today. I talk to her every day. She's 91 years old. So she was 11 years old when Operation Torch happened. I said, Mom, do you remember Operation Torch? She kind of goes, no, I don't. And I think that's kind of symbolic of where Operation Torch stands in the historiography and the popular memory of the nation. Mm-hmm. She does remember Normandy. I said, well, what about Normandy? Oh, yeah. That's when they invaded France. So
you think it was overshadowed in the public eye by the events unfolding in the Pacific War?
Well, Torch was the same time as Guadalcanal. So the battles of Guadalcanal were being fought that very month. There was a lot of security and censorship still operating on current operations. So people knew something was happening. I think at the time, Torch probably received more attention, but that attention, people are fickle in their attention, and that attention didn't last particularly long, because in the public eye, greater events happened, and the pace of victory, if you will, really picked up after November 1942. After that, it was pretty much unbroken success. So I think that somehow or the other, the memory of Torch kind of slipped away. People remember Sicily more than Torch, and I don't know why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they remember all the stuff that followed in its wake, but not it.
Yes.
Well, we remember it in this current issue in fine fashion with your two back-to-back articles covering first the landings in Morocco, and then subsequently the race for Tunisia. And the Axis powers are determined to get there before us as well. But first, let's start with the launching of this thing and all that was involved in the epic logistics and whatnot of getting force to the shores of North Africa and what then ensued. It sounds to me like we were a little bit lucky in some of this from your article.
I started off with a little story about a Colonel Randall going down the cargo netting into the landing craft that was going like this up and down, and a 50-year-old man. Kind of seems young at this point in my life, but at the time he was one of the older guys.
They were calling him Grandpa that day.
They were calling him Gramps, and going down with his map case and his carbine, and his reaction was, "Boy!" And when he finally made it to the boat, I should have practiced that. And this tells you that the colonel of an infantry regiment who's landing at Safi in Morocco, he didn't even participate in a single practice landing. And he's leading his troops ashore. And, as they're going on their landing craft towards the dark beach, they can't see anything, all the lights are out. It's a 5-mile run. So it's quite a ways at 10, 12 knots. And he's thinking that the coxswain is going in the wrong direction. He goes, veer more to the left, veer more to the left. And the coxswain goes, no, sir. You have to trust your compass. And he trusted the compass, but he was not the only colonel in the operation to override a young coxswain and say, land me somewhere else, much to their own regret. I mean, I talked about the landings that took place around the town of Fidolia, and they were supposed to come ashore in a really tight 1-mile wide package. In the event, it was 30 miles wide. I mean, without layers. 10 miles one way, 20 miles the other way. Crazy.
Yeah. There was a sense that I guess you could say rushed into this thing with not the requisite amount of training and drills and practice for what was going to ensue. That comes clear a number of places in your story. And the landings is one of them. You point out that had the weather gone in a worse direction for us, it would have just been a boondoggle.
Well, it's funny. I made a point in the article that I was invited to Algeria 5 years ago for the 75th anniversary celebrations, and I participated. And it was a great experience. But we had a wreath laying that was scheduled for the beach in one of the landing zones. There's a picture of it in the magazine article. That's the picture. Okay. And as we were driving in our heavily escorted motorcade to the beach site, which was about an hour away, it was raining and storming and lightning was coming down, and the guys were on their telephones trying to rearrange another venue for the ceremony because a lot of very important people were going to be showing up for that. And they found some sort of beachfront restaurant and took it over and managed to hold the event indoors. I was very impressed by the logistical capabilities of the military attaché in Algeria. And my thought is, I was standing there watching all the lightning and everything, saying, if this had happened in November of 1942, it would have been a fiasco. It would have been crazy, because as you saw in that picture, they couldn't even land on a beach without losing landing craft. Even on a perfectly calm beach, you can see a couple craft stranded. Mm-hmm. And by the end of the day, in Morocco, the Allies had lost approximately 2/3 of their landing craft. Now, they secured a small port the first day, and that's fortunate. But you can imagine what subsequent resupply and replenishment would be like with all your landing craft stranded on the beach with holes in them or whatever. So the Americans were fortunate in that aspect as well, that if they had been resisted more firmly, or if there had not been such a quick armistice, ceasefire, by the third or the fourth day, they would be wondering where the ammunition was. So another aspect of the operation that's really not talked about that much.
I believe Vince has been frozen out. Here we go.
Oh, did you catch that answer or not?
After ceasefire, things went blank for a moment.
Well, I was saying that they were lucky the ceasefire took place as soon as it did, because given the losses in landing craft, they would have been looking for ammunition after 2 or 3 days.
Man, oh man. Of lost landing craft. That bespeaks a deficiency in training.
Well, there was really no time to train. The operation was
factor here too, right? I mean,
I'm sorry.
There was a time factor which fed this sort of sense that they were rushing into this thing.
Well, they were doing it much later than Churchill wanted. He wanted the operation to go ahead in early October. Mm-hmm. But when you consider that the decision wasn't even reached until late July 24th, I think, and the orders were not even cut until early September, where is the time to practice? You're busy getting the troops together. You're busy trying to get the assets together. And there were some limited training exercises held in Chesapeake Bay in the month leading up to the action, but that was only for certain ships, and some ships didn't even get a chance to practice at all. So I'm talking about landing assault missiles and landing craft. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was very, very, Very limited training.
Well, so the landings could have been a real fiasco, but the weather gods shone on the Allies during that operation. Once we're over there, I believe this is the largest battle in the Atlantic Theater in the war, naval battle in the Atlantic Theater in the war, the Naval Battle of Casablanca, correct?
The Naval Battle of Casablanca, I call it the largest air, land, and the sea battle that was held in the Atlantic in World War II, because you had battleships on both sides. You had aircraft on both sides. You had submarines on the French side. You had heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers and minesweepers on the U.S. side, and an assortment of French destroyers and a cruiser on the other side. So yeah, there's a lot of ships involved. It was a very long action.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite trivia facts is that, as far as I know, it was the only occasion in World War II when a landing actually underway, when the landing craft were actually heading to the beach, came under fire from enemy surface forces. So the Japanese never did that. The Germans never did that, but the French did that against the Americans. It was also possibly, for all you trivia fans out there, and people measure stuff like this, it was possibly the longest gunfire hit obtained in World War II.
Right.
Yeah, it looks like Massachusetts hit a French destroyer at the range of 28,000 yards, going by the track charts produced by each side respectively. And it could be 1,000 yards less, maybe. It could even be a little bit further. But generally, warspites hit on Italian battleships at the Battle of Calabria in July 1940 is given that credit at 26,000 yards, or maybe when Scharnhorst hit the Glorious at 26,000 yards. But I think the record belongs to our USS Massachusetts hitting the French at 28,000 yards.
That's good right there. Now, this was Massachusetts' baptism, correct?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of amazing when you consider that the vast majority of the men had never participated in action. Most of them were straight out of naval training centers. A good portion of the officers had never been to sea before. The fact that her fire control radars blitzed out after the first salvo, those vacuum tube technology does have its limitations, especially when you're subjecting them to the shock of a 16-inch rifle.
That'll do it.
That'll do it. Yeah, she was going under visual fire control, and I think it's kind of amazing that she was able to do that personally. I think
it's pretty impressive.
It's very impressive.
Samuel Eliot Morison, and I'm paraphrasing here, described the Battle of Casablanca as sort of an old school battle wagon slugfest where they just pounding each other and all this stuff's going on. And the French battleship Jean Bart was at anchor the whole time. And she was still engaged in the fight, but she just got pummeled. I mean, here she is afterwards. This is the Massachusetts, and what else contributed to that snarled deck on the Jean Bart? It was the Massachusetts guns, but also there were
SPDs were dropping right. Ordnance on her, and a lot of that damage was actually inflicted 2 days afterwards when USS Augusta on 10 August was close offshore. The Americans thought that Jean Bart was totally disabled, but the French had repaired that turret. It was only a question of being able to train. Mm-hmm. That was the problem. She was jammed, and they greeted Massachusetts with some very near 15-inch salvos, which caught the attention of Admiral Hewitt, amongst others. Splashed them all with yellow water from the dye package that Jean Bart used in her shells. And Augustus got away as fast as she could, but Jean Bart chased her out with a couple of 15-inch salvos. After that, the carrier planes came in and did a proper job on the ship, made sure she was out of action.
Yeah, well, she brought her on herself on that one.
Hey, you got to do what you got to do, and I
can't blame her.
The French knew who they were fighting by that point, but you got to kind of admire the French attitude towards life. They were fighting for France, and it didn't matter who their enemies were. If they're firing on us, we're firing back.
Right. Yeah, they were in a real sticky situation. The Vichy French there, and there's some sort of diplomatic maneuvering that goes on as well to assure that they're going to capitulate in a way we don't have to keep pounding their assets or.
Yeah, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on. In fact, the diplomatic battle was probably bigger than the military battle in some respects. We had infiltrated a lot of agents, if you will, from the prototype of our intelligence service, the grandfather of the CIA. They were there as commercial agents and whatnot. And we had contacted a lot of the French officers and said, a lot of the French were not really very happy about cooperating with Germany. If that was the armistice terms, they were very anti-German. But again, as a military professional, it's your obligation to obey the dictates of your government, even if you don't particularly happen to agree with that government. And I think that the French officers and military in North Africa were professional, if there were nothing else. But we even went as far as sending the second in command of the entire operation to Africa, came ashore in a kayak from a submarine and met with French officers at a farmhouse. And that's how serious we were about trying to swing the politics in our direction. And in some respects, we succeeded at Algeria, particularly the port of Algeria. The fighting there was not as intense. We captured Admiral Darlan was captured by resistance fighters early on, and even though he was released from custody before dawn, he could see that the American landings were serious, they were real, and so that gave him the encouragement to come to a quick agreement and to eventually throw the lot of the French in with the Allies. So we only had to fight for 2 days, and I think that's just as good, and I think that's one of the reasons why the operation ended up being as successful as it was. I mean, I make the point in the book, I don't think I make it in the article, that some of the landings were really resisted quite strongly at Port Lyautey. French African soldiers made counterattacks, and they drove all the way to the beach. They were on the beach itself after one counterattack. So, things didn't go all our way, and there were moments of
there was more pushback like that in the landings.
Well, it's something people just don't even know about. Is kind of which makes it so interesting to me. There's more going on there than people appreciate. It wasn't just showing up, coming ashore, and putting on the laurel leaves. It was much more than that.
Right. Well, once we had Algeria in our pocket, the race was on for Tunisia, and this is where things get a little sticky for the Allied effort. Correct. This is the second article Vince has in the current issue, and they make a great back-to-back. When you read them, folks, make sure you do, because it's really one long continuous saga, actually. But let's talk about what happens in this. Our forces are trying to get there before the Axis forces do, and it literally is kind of a race to get there first.
It's a race that's built upon bad assumptions, I think, and a lack of imaginative responsibility. The thing about Tunisia is that it fell into a crack between the two British naval commands. You had the Mediterranean Fleet, which was undertaking Operation Torch, and that was commanded by Admiral ABC Cunningham. And then you had the Levant Fleet, or the Eastern Mediterranean, which was under Admiral Harwood of the Battle of the River Platte fame.
Mm-hmm.
And Tunisia was right along their command, the border between their two command zones. So the island of Malta, for example, was under Harwood's command. Cunningham was perhaps too preoccupied with the French and Italian fleets. He kept his powerful Force H, which included a lot of modern battleships. Basically, he kept them sailing far to the west in order to impress the French and Italians to make sure they stayed in port, which they were going to do in any case. On the east, Malta really couldn't mount any attacks against Tunisia because they thought that Tripoli was much more important. You got to remember that at this point, there were still German and Italian forces in Egypt. Yes, they were retreating from El Alamein, but they were still in Egypt. And there was a big concern that the push to the west by the Egyptian army, by the Eighth Army out of Egypt, would continue and not get stalled as it had been stalled in 1941 and in 1942 after offenses where the Germans held the line and then came back and counterattacked into Egypt. So there was that concern going on, and they were spending most of their assets trying to attack Tripoli, which was far to the east of Tunisia. So that was going on. You had the Americans and the British planners thinking that it would take the Axis about 6 to 10 weeks to build up one division in Tunisia. And so they figured there was plenty of time. I think it's kind of amazing that they discounted the energy of the Axis, the partners in this case. I mean, we know that the Germans from Norway, for example, or from Battle of the Bulge, or from even the attack on France in 1940, were certainly capable of tremendous energy in surprising the Allies. And they did it here again. And it took about 2 weeks for the British Navy to realize that Axis ships are sailing peacefully to Tunisia and landing troops and supplies with very little interference. I explained in the article that there were some Allied submarines in the area, but it's hard for a submarine to do much in waters that are so heavily mined against convoys that have air support. They really needed to do a lot more than what they did. It took them 2 weeks to realize that they had a problem, and then another week after that to really finally do something about it by actually destroying a convoy with a surface force of cruisers and destroyers. That's what was required. But by the time that happened, the Axis were already ashore in enough strength to make sure that they were able to hold on, even though the Allied forces, the British and American forces, did drive to within, I think it was 12 miles of Tunis at one point before they were pushed back in a counterattack. But my point is, of the 24, I can't remember the exact number of ships that made it to Tunisia before they were under intense attack. My thesis is a couple of those ships had been destroyed at sea. The margin of victory for the Axis, the margin by which the Allies failed to gain Tunisia in those days in November was so fine, and 12 miles isn't much, that a couple sinkings might have made all the difference in the world. And that would have saved a 6-month campaign. That's worth saving.
It was a close run thing, but you can't win them all, and the fighting would go on, as you say. I believe there are some lessons to be learned in the perils of inter-Allied command from this effort in Tunisia. Maybe you could mention some of those.
It's one of the areas where the Allies were able to overcome service affiliations and national affiliations and actually cooperate effectively in a major operation. Giving an American general ultimate authority over British battleships, for example. You don't see that happening very much in the history of warfare. Or giving a British admiral command over American task forces. You don't see that very often in the history of warfare. And I think the Americans and the British did this big time at Tunisia in Operation Torch. They were rewarded with a successful operation. They established a template, and they were able to take that template forward and apply it to other operations like the landings at Sicily, like the landings in Dragoon in southern France, and ultimately the landings at Normandy. And each one of those cases was successful. We think now that there's nothing easier than putting an army ashore and marching on to victory. But in fact, that is the hardest of all military operations. And the fact that the Allies succeeded repeatedly at doing that is something which deserves more attention, more respect than I think that it does. It's not a matter of course. It's not a given. It's in some respects it's unprecedented. And that was one of the tremendous accomplishments that by which the Allies were able to win in World War II. And I think a lot of it started in Operation Torch, when they were doing these things together and trying their different techniques and methods of doing things, and finding out that, hey, we have things to learn from the British. And the British had things to learn from the Americans. That was even more surprising.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, the way that we learned as we went in the thick of it all during World War II is always one of my recurring favorite themes of that war.
yeah.
You know, the mistakes being made early on, it's like, you don't just like throw in the towel. You learn from them and you fix them and you keep getting better as you go.
I'm on your team there, Eric. It's one of the things that really fascinates me, and it fascinates me more and more and more as time goes forward and I keep reading about this stuff. It's you can't get discouraged when you're fighting a war. You can't throw in the towel just because you lose a battle or two. You got to learn from that stuff. And the people who are able to learn, apply what I call the intellectual honesty to see where our mistakes were. How can we improve? We can listen to the advice of our friends, which is perhaps harder than learning from our enemies, and put all that together. The techniques that the American Navy, the U.S. Navy used to improve its performance, the battle experience reports, the intense scrutiny of actions, the fact that we insisted that officers hold responsibility for their actions more than other nations I could name. I mean, if you want me to get into details, I can tell you some really scary stories about recurrent failures. You're kept in command. And the Americans didn't really do too much of that, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I can see. So I agree with you completely. That is one of the fascinating aspects of World War II, which I really enjoy following up on.
And the fact that we sort of interchange command, services mixed in the various commands of one side or the other, that's such a sea change from the American approach in World War I, where we never technically joined the alliance. The French and British officers, all these doughboys are showing up from the United States, and they want to just plug them into their the gaps in their own lines under their commanders. And the U.S. command is like, that's simply not going to happen. That is not going to happen. They're going to fight under our flag and under their own commanders. But in this war, with the navies, they were able to find ways to do it in the necessities of the moment. And that's probably a pretty good lesson.
I think it's an excellent lesson. Right now, I'm reading about some of the first operations in World War II in the North Sea. The invasion of Norway, which was, by the way, was the very first instance where we had a multi-carrier task force operating off of an enemy shore in support of an amphibious landing. The British counter landings around Trondheim in April 1940. And you compare that to the performance of the carriers off Torch. Or if you really want to get high level, you compare that to the U.S. fast carriers in the Pacific. And it's like you're starting from baby steps. Baby steps doesn't even describe it. It's they were crawling, and what they could do, they were putting a couple dozen bi-wing bombers over a beachhead, and over the course of against ground aircraft, it was just slaughter basically, and kind of pathetic. And you take that to the point where Torch, they received effective air support. And you take that to the Pacific in 1945, where they were able to assert air superiority with carrier aircraft over Tokyo itself. I mean, what a progress! And Torch is kind of like a road mark in that progress. But I think it's a very important road mark, and one that's worth looking at. And I like looking at the very first amphibious landings and comparing those to Torch, and it's all a learning process. Normandy did not happen by accident.
Right. A lot of learning and trial and error went into the success of that and these earlier operations. You mentioned the naval operations in Norway in the early part of the war. That's something I've wanted to see more of in the magazine. That's a fascinating naval chapter of World War II. It gets a little overshadowed because it's so early,
Well, that would make the operations of the British carriers between April 24th and April 28th off the coast of Norway would make a fascinating article.
Well, we'll talk after this, won't we?
Okay, well, we can talk, yeah. and
you saw it here, folks. A story idea was born.
Yeah, story idea was
very
born.
eyes.
Yeah. I lost track of what my next point was.
But interrupt you.
It's okay.
Got to do business there for a minute.
Yeah.
Well,
But
and
I think there's a lot of things in Torch that if you look at it as part of a progress, part of comparing it to the early days, to the first major operation, to the final results in the Pacific in 1945, it's all part of the same story. And I think returning to your original point, the fact that the Army and the Navy were able to cooperate so effectively is one aspect, but the fact that they were able to cooperate with the British Army and Navy as well is even more spectacular. And reading about the Germans and how they couldn't even, I mean, the way their Air Force and Navy cooperated was you don't win wars like that. You don't win wars when your biggest enemy is your fellow service. And I'm sorry.
They were all were jealous of their Führer's attention and favors, and no love lost there between the Wehrmacht and the Kriegsmarine for sure. But
no, they're rivals for budget dollars. So
right, yes, some things never change. Well,
and Japanese were worse in some respects. So
oh yeah, that's true. No. It's all very interesting. I could talk to you all day about this.
Well, it's a secret weapon of the Allies. It's one of the things that people don't talk about that the Allies did that the Axis powers didn't do. And yeah, we had more money, and yeah, we had more resources, and yeah, we had more population. But as any passing familiarity with the history of warfare will tell you, resources and population, all that stuff doesn't always give you victory. Sometimes it's the better, more direct and more focused force.
And the moral of the story being the more coordinated force too.
Yeah. My wife always tells me that communications is the basic function of society, and I think communications is also the basic talent that militaries need to cultivate and get really good at. I mean, you could write the history of World War II from the perspective of failed communications and make a really good book out of it, I suspect.
Sounds fascinating. Well, thank you for celebrating the 80th anniversary of the launching of Operation Torch with us, Vincent. And I commend your articles to all our readers. If you haven't delved into them yet, we're getting some great feedback on them. And it's always great to have you in the magazine, Vince. Always an honor.
Well, always my pleasure, Eric. I enjoy the platform that you provide to authors like me. And I probably appreciate even more the information that comes out of that platform. The fact that it's good reading every time, every issue that comes out, and it teaches me things I don't know. And so thank you for editing an excellent publication.
Well, God bless you for that. I think I'll end on that right there. That's as good as
at the top.
You heard it from the guest, folks. Unsolicited comment, and we're glad to have it. Thank you very much, Vince, for being with us. Look forward to having you on here again.
Oh, Eric, thank you much. Appreciate it.
I guess that's it for us today, folks. Thank you for joining us for another edition of the Naval History Podcast, presented by Proceedings in the U.S. Naval Institute. And we look forward to seeing you again here very soon. Until then, I wish you fair seas and following seas and fair winds and following seas. Until then, bon voyage.